Hey y'all, and welcome to today's story about a girl who lives in a world where the names of everyone's true love and worst enemy are written on their wrists at the age of 16. This story comes from Reddit user Ecstatic and Insatiate, and you can find it on their subreddit Shoring Up Fragments. We hope you enjoy this story, and if you do, please subscribe to the channel to get more amazing stories from Reddit authors, and check out the author's subreddits in the description below. Thanks for listening. Joy never let anyone else see her wrists. She waited until the exact moment of her birth, the 23rd of August at 3:16 in the morning, and just laid there, staring at her wrists, at the raised marks forming themselves on her arms already. The lines were so jagged, it was as if she had carved them herself. But Joy didn't let the letters finish forming. No, she grabbed the medical bandage at her side and wrapped her wrist tightly, round and round and round. The secret of her fate waited under there. That morning, at breakfast, Joy's mother had given her arms long stares over the table. Her smile turned misty as she murmured, "I remember the day I saw your father's name show up on my arm for the first time." Joy just nodded. She knew the enemy's name already, the drunk woman who didn't see Dad's car 2 years ago, the one who had left this house so hollow and half empty. "What does it say?" her mother pressed. Joy just shrugged. She lifted a cup of black coffee to her lips. She didn't like black coffee yet, but she was trying. "I don't know," she said. Her mom's brow wrinkled in confusion. Why not? Joy wanted to tell her, but the thought was still a half-baked pot in the kiln of her mind. Stop it now and it would shatter. But surely, her life meant more than the 2 birthmarks on her arms. The first boyfriend came a year later. He held the pink bandages on Joy's forearms, and it was a blistering summer day. But Joy still kept the names out of her sight. The boy's name was George. He was just 18, all soft-eyed and sweet. He kept tracing circles over the inside of her right wrist and asking her, "What if it says my name?" His right arm said Joyce, which he argued was close enough. Joy was only 17, but she knew how to fake a smile. She did not have to look at her wrist to know it did not say his name. "You never know," she said. And she never wanted to. Her girlfriends all giggled over the names on their wrists that first year. They only got first names, though one girl was lucky enough to get the first letter of a surname. A Brandon K or R maybe. She was willing to be open-minded. At sleepovers, Joy's friends would nudge her ribs and ask her, "Come on, what are you waiting for?" She picked at the feathers poking out of her pillow and murmured, "Maybe I'll never look." All the girls gaped at her. But one said, "What if you get married and realize it's the wrong name?" "Can you even imagine?" another muttered, her face bright with indignation. 8 billion people in the world, and you think you can figure it out by yourself? Joy bit at her lip until it bled, and that night, in the bathroom, after all the other girls had fallen asleep, she almost did it. She almost pried her bandages off. Perhaps one of those girls' names would show up on her left wrist. She wanted to wheel back time and tell that room of girls exploding in laughter at her, "My life is what I make of it." The bandages became a deal breaker in college, though. There were men who wouldn't date her without knowing if she was forever material, and women who would only hook up because they weren't name compatible. Joy found herself in so many bars, half drunk, with so many dates who would stare at her like she was a stranger when they saw the bandages under her sleeves. She was too drunk to mumble anything about fate or choice, so she would just sip her drink and mark another name off the checklist of her mind. Until him. Both her hands pulsed hot when he first walked into the room. It was as instant as walking outside and knowing the smell of rain, and just as comforting and eternal. Joy met him in the old way, eyes meeting across a dimly lit, crowded room. He was dark-haired and stormy-eyed, and he stared at her like she was the only person in the bar. He sat and said, looking at his wrist, "You wouldn't happen to be Joy, would you?" Joy gave a delirious nod. For the first time, the raw, crashing wave of desire hit her. She wanted to tear the bandage from her wrist and know instantly. But instead, she gave him a tipsy smile and pulled up her sleeve to show him her covered marks. "I'm afraid I don't know yours." Damn. How old are you? 24. 8 years since you've seen your wrists? That's a line for the resume. He slid into the seat next to her like it was made for him, and she noted he smelled like sandalwood. "How'd you pull that off?" Joy laughed. "A lot of showers in the dark." "You'll have to show me how you manage that." She slapped his arm and laughed, and later that night, she did. He rewrapped her bandages for her while she lay on her back with her eyes closed, and when he finished, Joy asked him, "What does it say?" The man who would be her husband gave her a dewy smile and said, "I'm not telling, but I know what I'll make it say." He held her wrist as he kissed her. Her husband's name was Elijah. His wrist said joy and ira, happiness and rage, as if he held both halves of the universe in his fate. Joy traced her fingers over his left wrist and asked him if he knew what it meant. She had asked him a dozen times, and every time he shrugged and said nothing. Until last year, 3 years into dating, he told her, "That's my father's name." She held him as he cried. She knew better than to ask why, as memory had carved pain into the lines of his face. Even as she held him, she stared down at her own wrist. She was 27, and the dread of her left wrist kept her up at night, like a storm she knew could not be stopped. She had found her love, and she did not need to see her wrist to be sure of it. But the promise of her birthright was out there, an enemy come to end it all. Joy held her husband and her breath, and she waited. Even in the hospital, giving birth to her first child, Joy did not let the nurses uncover her wrists. The nurses seemed to hover around her like she was unsound after that. After all, who could live 20 straight years never uncovering 4 inches of her forearms? Joy could, and she did. She raised her daughter without knowing. She loved her husband without knowing. She carved her own sense from the world. This little corner of perfection, her husband, her child, her little cottage at the end of the road. Joy did not need more than that. The years wheeled by as they do, and Elijah wrapped her wrist for her every morning, even when the disease chewing at his nerve endings bit by bit made his hands tremble so hard, Joy had to rewrap them when he was gone. Joy often wondered if she would look at her wrists and see Huntington's there, as if God knew how to play a good joke, after all. The day her daughter turned 16, Joy sat at the breakfast table with her. The room hummed with déjà vu. Her daughter stared at the clock and said, "You're sure it was 4:16 p.m.? On the dot. Joy sipped her coffee. Elijah had already left for work, and it was only the two of them in the big and empty house. And she tried not to think of this house without Elijah in it. "Aren't you afraid of what it says?" her daughter murmured. "Honey, I'm too old and stubborn to divorce your daddy now," Joy winked at her. "Plus, I want the life insurance." Her daughter didn't smile at the joke. She said, "No, your enemy. Aren't you scared? What if you're like Grandma and there's someone awful out there?" Joy hesitated and set down her coffee. She leaned toward her daughter and said gently, "Perhaps you only have one if you go looking." Her mother held on to more than her father's ghost. Joy watched her mother live with poison in her mouth even 40 years later. "But didn't you go looking for Dad?" Joy shook her head. For a moment, she was in a bar almost 3 decades ago. She lifted her coffee mug to her half-smiling lips. "If I'd been looking, I might have missed him." Can you imagine losing a man like that over a silly little name? It was already unfair enough losing him cell by cell. Joy's daughter said nothing, but Joy knew that look in her daughter's eye. The gears of her mind were turning. Later that afternoon, when her daughter's marks should have appeared, there was nothing on either wrist, just a flawless span of tan skin on both arms. Maybe it would appear. Maybe it would change. But for now, Joy's heart swelled with pride and hope. At least her daughter had been brave enough to look. As her daughter scrambled down the hall to show her father, Joy stayed behind in the doorway to her daughter's room. She rubbed at her own wrists. The skin below was smooth and unmarked. For the first time in her life, she did not wonder. She knew exactly what her wrists said, and what they didn't say. She had written her fate herself, after all. Hey y'all, if you like today's story by Ecstatic and Insatiate, check out her subreddit, Shoring Up Fragments, down in the description below. And if you want to find out more about the serial stories that she and Nick of Night are writing, you can also check out that link in the description as well. I'm Sir Pinkbeard, thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next video.